Welcome everybody to Practical Inclusion for another week. This is the 6th week that I've been running this LinkedIn Live, and I'm very grateful to those of you who have tuned in for most of them, and there's a few of you, that's great. And also those who are catching the replays across my social media channels. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that may be watching me today, or who are watching the replay. I am taking a bit of a change of tack today, and I don't have a guest on. I have asked you to provide some questions so that we might talk about a few different topics from my perspective. And you have done that, and you've provided some really interesting topics for us to discuss today. So I'm looking forward to jumping into these. Just before I do, whether you are watching live or on the replay, I'd love you to place in the comments a number 1 if you are a diversity and inclusion professional or you work in the diversity and inclusion space in some shape or form. Or a number 2, if you're more an interested party, you perhaps have a different role in your organisation, and you're interested in this work, you might be looking to move into this kind of field, whatever other category you place yourself in. So a 1 if you are a diversity and inclusion professional, specialist, and a 2 if you're not. And if you can do that, even if you're watching the replay, that'd be great. I'd love today for any of you to send any comments through or questions that you have as I'm talking, and I'll see if I can address them at the time, and if not, I will certainly do so in the comments afterwards in the post that goes around. So what am I going to start with? I'm going to start with a question that was provided from Craig Wood. Craig wrote on the post that I put out, where do I start? Being one of the main question that kind of rolls around in his head when thinking about the diversity and inclusion space. Where do I start? And I hear this often. I hear this from many people, but I also see the opposite. I see people start in places that perhaps they shouldn't. And so I want to talk to that a little bit as well. So let's maybe start there. And I've seen over the past couple of years a number of organisations, embark in the diversity and inclusion space for the first time. And the first step they've taken is to create a strategy. Now, you would think, yep, Bree, that's your gig. That's what you like people to do, have a proper diversity and inclusion strategy. It's a great place to start. But it's actually not at all, because you have to start with the data. And too many of the diversity and inclusion strategies I see from organisations not only don't start with data, but actually don't even have actions in them that require data collection or analysis, a deep, thorough data collection or analysis. I get the temptation. There are a plethora of what seem like low-hanging fruit in the diversity and inclusion space. And you see plans come out with, anywhere up to 70, 80 different actions that this organisation is going to enact. But the problem is they have no idea whether those actions are going to be specific and successful in their organisation. And until you understand what the issues are for you, you can't start a diversity and inclusion strategy. So where would I start then? And how do you collect that data and make that data collection meaningful? And I'm going to be totally biased and upfront here. I do think that organisations should get an external person in to do an analysis of their current equity position, looking at both quantitative and qualitative data. And the reason I say that an external person doing that is of value is because there's not usually the expertise within the organisation that's just starting on diversity and inclusion work to be able to do that effectively. Because yes, you'll have people with data skills probably. You might have one inclusion person who's been appointed to drive this work, but to actually have an experienced professional not only collect and analyse that data, but be able to see and interpret the nuances that exist within it. So let's give an example. Say we're going to do this data collection, and one of the things we're going to do is do our gender pay gap analysis. Now, I would hope that would be part of a broader pay analysis around other aspects of diversity, but say we're starting with a gender pay gap analysis. Now, you might find that across the organisation, there's a pay gap of 14%. And you might stop there. 14% matches the Australian gender pay gap. That may change as a result of the pandemic, but you might say, okay, well, our pay gap's, reasonable, it's on par, it's fine. What you need is to actually delve into that pay gap. Look at the departments, look at gender segregation, look at like-for-like roles, look at allowances, look at superannuation. There's a whole bunch of nuances that go into that pay gap analysis. And if you do that properly, you are more likely to identify areas where you can tap into and really create meaningful change, and not just something that's tokenistic. So an example might be, you might do all that work and find that the reality is in your organisation, remuneration is dealt fairly and justly, but your senior roles are more likely to be filled by men than they are than women. So your pay gap, your 14% pay gap, is all about seniority, and you haven't found any other nuances in that data. If that's the case, then you can move towards representation. But it's not as simple as, right, we know we've got too many men in leadership roles. We need to get more women into those leadership roles. So let's do mentoring programs. Let's do women in leadership programs. Let's build up the skills of the women so that they will take those roles. That may work if you get lucky. But what if the men in those senior leadership roles have been there for 15 years and they're all in their early 40s and are likely to be there for another 10, 15 years? You are wasting all this time and effort on mentoring and skill development programs for women that are never going to get access to those leadership roles. So unless you use the data, you can't really identify what the issues are for your organisation. So for that particular organisation, they need to focus on what they're going to do about the leadership structure and how they create diversity within that context, knowing now what they know about retention and about representation. So Craig, I hope that gives you, and I can see you're listening in, I hope that gives you a sense of where I would start. I think you have to do a proper data analysis, and then the diversity and inclusion plan will really just flow out of that and will provide you a really clear indication of how you can prioritise your actions. I also believe that you shouldn't have 1,000 actions to start with. You might want to map them all out over a 2 to 5 year span, but you really want to prioritise them and time them and find out where your value for money is in terms of the initial work that you take on. So I would start with the data. I would advocate for having an external person do that, particularly if you're going to collect qualitative data. Because if you're going to collect qualitative data, so if you're going to ask staff and clients about their experience who are diverse, having an external person do that piece is important, so that they can feel safe and feel that they can share. But that's absolutely where I would start when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Now, Joe's sent through a question. Hey, Joe, thanks for tuning in. What are your thoughts on inclusion in exclusive spaces? So that's an interesting one. And maybe can you define exclusive spaces for me in terms of what you mean? And maybe if you do that in the comments, and I'll just tackle here Craig's response. If there's no accurate data source, would you recommend the implementation of data collection as a primary initiative? Yes, absolutely. Because if you can't collect that data in the first place, then you can't track it. And you don't know if you've been successful or not. And if you can't track success, then you can't weave diversity and inclusion into your business case. And we're going to talk about that a bit later today if I get to it. But, the ultimate goal and aim of this work is to make sure that the goals and targets that you set become embedded as real targets in the organisation that the organisation's committed to. And you can't do that if you can't report on it. what gets measured matters. It's 100% true. So that's quite often what those initial data analysis will find. It'll find the spots where the data is missing, and you can focus initially on how to collect that data. All right, so I might wait for Jo to get back on that question so I can just quite be clear as to what types of exclusive spaces that she's talking about. Larissa said WGEA has great data. It does. It's a good start, but organisations have to go deeper than what WGEA asks of them. And there are some sectors and industries that the WGEA data isn't particularly helpful when you're trying to shift change in diversity and inclusion. And there's two kind of concerns with that. One is that it is quite often, well, it is binary data and it's very focused on gender and not yet really encompassing of broader diversity. But also it's not always context. It's not always, doesn't work well in the context of specific industries. So for example, in the higher ed industry where I came from, the WGEA data wasn't particularly helpful. The benchmarking data wasn't. Because it didn't make sense in our context. So you'd need, doing the WGEA data is a great start, but make sure you just check that against what makes sense in the work that you're doing and how you're going to create change in your organisation. And Craig said that opens a whole raft of questions about how, when, why, and who to ask. Absolutely it does, and requires, some experience and some expertise in that so you don't end up in rabbit holes and you don't end up in trouble as to what kind of data you're collecting. Been involved in so many discussions about whether it's right to collect certain pieces of data or not, whether people will provide their data, and that's probably a whole conversation for another day. It's complex, but I still absolutely hold the position that you still collect the data. You always provide people option not to participate. And not to submit their data, and you'll always be very careful about your privacy and confidentiality around the data collection and your ethics. Who's going to see the data, what it's going to be used for. Don't collect data that you don't need. Jo's clarified her question there. Is it okay for minority groups to be exclusive and not open to everyone? This is a really good question, and now I know exactly what you mean. I believe yes. And the reason I believe yes is because for the majority of people, most places are safe. And because that's the society we live in, that for the majority of people, most places are safe. But for people from marginalised and disadvantaged communities, there are many places that are unsafe. We are in a position where we still need to provide safe spaces for people from marginalised groups so that they can have that experience. It's like I've often had men talk to me about how they went to a particular meeting or were involved in a team that was all women except for them, and how uncomfortable they were and how confronting that was. Well, when you experience that more often than you don't, then I think there is absolutely a need to have inclusive spaces for minority groups. So yes, Jo, it is a great question. And my opinion is yes, in utopia, when we've reached equality, no, there'd be no need for those spaces. But, you and I have talked much about this. We're certainly not there yet. So until we are there, we need them. And one of these discussions comes up particularly in the higher ed sector around queer rooms or queer spaces. And yeah, my opinion certainly sits now that I think they're necessary and they're incredibly valuable. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question that I was given, and that came from Tamsin, and it was about, she was interested in an equity impact assessment tool. Now, I had to do a bit of research about this and realised that firstly, I couldn't find a nice simple checklist. So essentially what an equity impact assessment tool does is provide a framework for decision making that takes into account equity considerations. Now, Tamsin's question was looking at that and a type of decision making checklist that could be used to govern decisions, particularly in times of a pandemic or crisis. And so specifically where my mind went was straight to what we're seeing, which is redundancies of large amounts of people. And we're seeing disproportionately women lose their jobs in comparison to men. Now, I haven't seen a lot of stats around other elements of diversity, which unfortunately is, quite often the case. If anyone's seen something, it'd be great if you could send me through the link, and I'd love to share that around. But certainly there's data around the fact that women have been 4 times more likely to lose their job in this pandemic, and those numbers are really unclear because JobKeeper is hiding the unemployment rate, essentially. So we don't know how many. There doesn't seem to be any gender data around JobKeeper. So if we get to a pandemic and we actually go backwards in terms of our diversity and inclusion work, how do we stop that from happening? How do we stop the diversity being, the people from diverse backgrounds being the first to get kicked out? And yes, having an assessment tool, so a checklist that was considered when they were making those types of decisions could help. It certainly allows people to start discussing it, but I'm not sure, Tamsin, if that's actually going to shift the dial. I still think that people's biases and this concept and this idea people have, and I've heard people say this in the last few months, that this is a pandemic, we need to get back to core business. We'll get back to the diversity and inclusion stuff later. And it's there where the problem is. It's that the diversity and inclusion is seen not as core business. Now, we know the statistics show that, diverse teams are 30% more innovative, 30% more productive. To me, that's core business. But for some reason, leaders don't necessarily believe those statistics or buy into them totally. And so in times, particularly in times of crisis, we go down to risk, we go down to what feels good, and we completely ignore those statistics. The fact that we might actually need to be more innovative and productive in a harder market, for some reason doesn't count as core business. So I think a tool would help, and I'd love to chat to you, Tamsin, about finding something or building something that could really work. I saw in the Times Higher Education Review that University of Sydney have done that, and they're using a diversity dashboard to apply an equity lens to their decisions, and they've been really public about this pandemic not taking them backwards in terms of their equity initiatives. So it'd be great to see that from other industries and sectors as well, that kind of push. And I think if you're in an organisation like that, then a tool like that would absolutely have impact. But it's probably going back to the first point about making sure that that diversity and inclusion work has been set up well with clear targets and goals and is embedded into the organisation so that they know that this is important and will keep it important and as core business when a pandemic hits. So I hope I've kind of at least seeded some thoughts there, and it'd be nice to have a chat with you about that further, Tamsin, and if anybody else has any ideas on that kind of concept, that would be really good. Now, the other topic that came up during the week was the old argument between the business case for diversity and it being the fair, just and right thing to do. And, this is a topic I've talked on quite a bit. I came across a statement, a quote on a diversity company's website that said, for too long, people have seen diversity and inclusion as just the right thing to do, whereas the most important thing is that it's about the business case. And that kind of made me feel a bit icky, because the business case is important and is what is the motivator and driver for this work, absolutely, but it shouldn't be the why and the everything. And research has shown that if we want to get leaders to really become diversity champions and drive this work, then we need to convince them of both. We need them to know that it's the right and just thing to do and that it has business benefits as well. So I think the discussion should always be even to those points, because that's my why. My why is because it's just and fair. But the jackpot that we hit was that diversity and inclusion work is also good for business. And that's an advantage that we have to use, because the reality is we work and live in a capitalist society. And when we're talking about workplace inclusion, things have to make sense from a business perspective as well as being equal and just. There's been a few articles released in the last month or so, particularly in the cultural diversity space, talking about how the business case really is rubbish in terms of it shouldn't be used as a reason for doing diversity and inclusion work. We should do it because we have to do it. It is right and fair and just. And I totally wholeheartedly agree with those arguments. But I don't think we create change just by focusing on that. I think we create faster change by also recognising that there are business benefits to this and tapping into the motivators and drivers of our business leaders in that space to drive the diversity and inclusion work. I did just over the weekend, I wrote a guide on how to engage your executives in diversity and inclusion strategies. And it's now available. If you sign up to my mailing list, you can get that free guide. And in that, it does talk about finding those business motivators and how you link your D&I work to the pain points of the organisation or the challenges that an executive member is facing in their day-to-day tasks, and how you have to embed that work you have to embed your diversity and inclusion strategies into what makes sense for the business. Otherwise, you're going to be taking a long time to create meaningful change. And I do think it's still meaningful because, as I said, we hit both things. We hit that it's the right thing to do, and and it makes sense from a business perspective. Now, when I was thinking about this, and also thinking about the equity impact tool question, I started at the same time. An issue was happening in the cricket world last week. So in regional Victoria, we've all been given the green light to play cricket again. And I'm on the Geelong Cricket Association's board, and there was all discussions about the rules that have come out around making cricket COVID safe. One of the initial rules that was released was that there wouldn't be any opportunity to share cricket gear. So cricket gear is expensive: pads, helmets, gloves, bats. And for juniors, and also a lot in women's cricket, there is shared equipment. So there's a kit bag and everybody shares the equipment. And the initial advice was that we wouldn't be able to do that anymore. So what I saw from a number of clubs was equity really kick into gear. So clubs had gone and asked all their senior men's players, if you've got spare gear sitting in your shed, can you donate it to the club and we'll give it out to the players? And so, heaps and heaps of gear was donated into this kind of grouping to be shared out. And I really loved how quickly that happened and how that equity was provided instantly, because it was recognised that there would be people who wouldn't be able to play because of that rule. Turns out they scrapped the rule anyway, so it was a waste of time. But it got me thinking that step further. Everybody's really keen and happy to provide equity if it means they don't necessarily lose anything of value. But imagine that people didn't have spare kit. And imagine if we asked those players, those senior men's players, those who could afford to go out and buy new gear, if we asked them to give up their gear and go and buy new gear, so that the people who couldn't afford new gear had some pads and bats to use. That's pushing the boundary, isn't it, in terms of what people will accept as equity initiatives and what they will get defensive about. And you could imagine the backlash if we asked people to do that. And I thought about that, putting that in the context of the workplace and redundancies. And when we're thinking about redundancies and we're thinking about the people who are more likely to be able to find work if they are made redundant, as opposed to those who will find it more difficult and will face biases and judgments and prejudices and other barriers. So Yeah, I just, that analogy came up in my head, and I thought it was worth sharing because it's an interesting concept that we talk about when we talk, whenever I talk diversity and inclusion, somebody asks a question about reverse discrimination. And of course I say that doesn't exist and is a furphy. But it is that concept that how far are we willing to go to create equity? And some of us are willing to go a little bit, but when we're asked to actually give up our privilege to do that, it's a slightly different question. Sally has written, it's challenging when some of the leaders won't see that there are still issues with inclusion. Yes, it's this apathy, isn't it? That so much you see this apathy of leaders that it's all okay now. We're inclusive, we've got all these wonderful initiatives and everything's fine. And I'm going to say data again, Sally, but you know that was going to be my answer too, to really demonstrate that that's not the case. But it can be hard to find that more nuanced data when you've already done a lot of work, like I've seen your organisation do, how you keep kind of drilling into that and seeing the difference. But thanks for your comment. So I'm going to wrap up in a second. If you've got any last questions, feel free to put it through the comments. I hope you have enjoyed my rambling. So certainly took the opportunity to kind of spurt out what's been in my head over the last week or so. As I mentioned, I do have a free guide. If you want to sign up to my mailing list, you'll get that guide. And I'd be really interested in your feedback and thoughts on it and how I can improve that. Yes, I'm here doing this work and trying to make this my primary income. So I do need to sell stuff. But what I'm really interested in is whether I'm creating value. And if a guide like that's creating value and creating change, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But if you think it needs some tweaking or there's some things missing, I'd love to hear that as well. Things are really ramping up in terms of, I guess it's nearing the end of the year and people are getting more into getting back into the swing of things, I suppose, a bit. And I'm getting lots of requests to run workshops in organisations and teams around inclusive leadership, around diversity in the workplace, or gender equity in COVID times. So if you think that's something that you might want to weave into your end of year days, or you're starting to find space or time for that, please reach out. And Joe, who's on with us, Joe and I have started to roll out our Linked Out program, and we're getting some real interest for that program, which we are so excited about. And so if you want to hear more about that, LGBTIQA+ inclusion, particularly for regional Australia, then please reach out to either of us. And I will catch you next week. I've got Sam Turner joining me next week, who's from Male Champions of Change. So Sam's incredible. I met Sam through the Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging Committee for Queer Screen that I'm a part of. And I've been really impressed with her approach to this work. So I think you'll love that. So please tune in next week. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in and for your wonderful comments. And I will catch you next week.